Today, Rebecca is coming to us from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and her research is at this intersection of housing, equity, and the environment. So I think there's a lot of overlap with those of us who think about environmental sciences, but I'm excited to hear about it from a new angle. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. Does this feel like a good volume for the size of this room? Okay, good. Great. So as Anna just said, I'm Rebecca Walker. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at the Humphrey School studying urban planning. Broadly, my work is interested in the historic mechanisms that produce environmental disparities in our cities today, and then also what we can do to sort of intervene or change that. It's really exciting for me to be here today talking to this department in particular. Before coming to the U, I received a master's degree from the Department of Land, Air and Water Resources at UC Davis, studying soil biogeochemistry. So this feels a little bit like coming home. And then upon coming to the U, I was here to work with Sarah Hobby to study nutrient cycling in cities, and then ultimately my work involved to pursue more interdisciplinary questions. And I'm really excited to share some of those results with you all today. Okay, so let's see. Okay, got it working, great. Just to give you a quick overview of the outline of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about racial disparities in the urban environment, and sort of the state of the literature on historic processes that have contributed to contemporary environmental disparities. And then I will share the results of two chapters from my dissertation research. The first, I should say, I'm a very mixed methods researcher. So my first chapter will be presenting archival research, trying to understand the emergence of racial segregation in Minneapolis and its consequences for urban green spaces. I think it's really important to share that in the context of the next study because it helps us have like a really meaty empirical way of understanding some of the mechanisms that are shaping the results in the quantitative study that I'll also present here today. So the second study is a comparison of intra-urban heat exposure associated with two mechanisms that promoted racial segregation in urban environments. One is racially restrictive housing covenants, and the other is redlining. And I'll give you good definitions for those as we move through. And then finally, I'll conclude with a few overarching takeaways for implications for urban environmental research, as well as management. And so I think that I hope that will be able to make this salient to this department if we're thinking about how we do research in cities and with communities in cities, and as we're shaping future practitioners that'll go out into the world to do this management work. Okay. Racial disparities in urban environments are well documented. Whether the environmental variable is access to water in Jackson, Mississippi right now, or in Flint, Michigan several years ago, whether it's the distribution of brownfield sites, exposure to air pollution, exposure to extreme heat, broadly across all of these environmental variables, we see the disparities in the urban environment are structured or correlated highly with the racial demographics of the city, as well as the class, as the socioeconomic demographics of the city. And these disparities are likely to be deepened by climate change. So inequalities and exposure to climate change related risks are already present in cities. Those are extreme heat, vulnerability to flooding, extreme storms, fires. All of those are structured. All of those are going to impact communities differently depending on where you live in cities, and then also the resources you have to recover post-disaster. And so this is sort of the foundations of the environmental justice and climate justice literature. As we've increasingly come to understand that these disparities are there, that has led to the emergence of of a subfield that's becoming known as the ecology of segregation, particularly in the wake of the racial justice uprisings in 2020. We saw a push for more consideration and awareness of how structural racism is shaping our environments and how we should think about it as environmental researchers. And so these are obviously reviews and big journals that a lot of scientists are reading. And so one of the key questions in this new emerging subfield, the ecology of segregation, is what are the historic processes that have driven contemporary racial disparities in the urban environment? And sort of to try and answer that question, the bulk of this work has relied on what I'm going to call redlining studies. And so a redlining study is when you take an environmental variable. So here we have surface temperature. You overlay the redlining map, and I'll explain what the redlining map is in just a second. And then you look at the disparities that fall according to that map and sort of the grades that it gives different neighborhoods. And that's supposed to tell you something about the historical processes that, that produce these disparities. So what is redlining? Redlining refers to the New Deal era federal policy of racially discriminatory mortgage lending. Ooh, that's interesting. All right, we'll just roll with it. I updated my slides, but I realized I haven't refreshed on this computer. Right, okay, so New Deal era federal policy of racially discriminatory mortgage lending. And so what this looked like, or what we see on this map, are grades that are assigned to different neighborhoods that were then used to determine these neighborhoods' eligibility for a federally backed mortgage. And so this is the redlining map for Minneapolis. And there are 4 colors on the map. The green is a little bit faded, but there's green, which corresponds to the letter A, which was the best grade. Blue is B, so still okay. Yellow is they would call it declining. And then red were considered risky or hazardous, too hazardous to give a mortgage to. And the assignment of these grades was inextricably linked to the racial demographics of the neighborhood. So if people of color lived in that neighborhood, they would not receive an A or a B grade. And to receive that A grade, it had to be a racially homogeneous white neighborhood. And so through this mechanism, racial discrimination and loans then led to a decreased ability of people of color to purchase homes and build intergenerational wealth. And so that's contributed to sort of the lasting racial wealth gap in the US. Okay, so now that we understand what redlining is, so what we do in the redlining studies is take our environmental variable, we see these grades, A being the best, that's the blue, D being the worst, that's the red, and we see how those maps that were used to determine who got mortgages correspond with environmental outcomes today. Okay, great. This seems useful, and apparently a lot of people think that this seems really useful because there's been a huge proliferation of studies that have done just that for tree canopy cover, for urban heat island, for oil wells, air pollution, you name it, someone has overlaid the redlining map with it. And that's been really useful because it's pushed the conversation on, okay, this seems important. It seems like this map is telling us something about the urban environment. However, before I move on, and so the key mechanistic relationship proposed by these studies, I've taken this infographic model from a study by Nardone et al., looking at green spaces and redlining. And so the mechanism that they propose is that the late 1930s neighborhood sociodemographics influenced the grade that was given by the HOLC mapping, and that as well as the demographics themselves correlate to environmental outcomes today, in this case, green spaces. So, okay, that's our basic mechanistic understanding. We have legacy effects of sociodemographics in the 1930s and the effects specifically of mortgage lending. However, as these studies have proliferated, there's also been sort of growing awareness of critiques of these redlining environmental analyses. Sort of an obvious one, redlining is only one of many policies that produced racial segregation in the urban environment. And building off of that, the urban landscape was already very segregated before redlining. And so that suggests that there might be multiple mechanisms at play. And further, new research has questioned how much those maps that I showed you with the 4 grades actually influenced who received a federally backed mortgage. There's some debate in the literature about the importance of these maps in terms of lending. And so that calls into question this relatively simplistic mechanistic understanding of drivers of our contemporary environmental inequalities, and suggests that we need to broaden our understanding and pursue other avenues, other hypotheses that might explain the environmental outcomes we got today. Because obviously, as all of those spatial overlay studies have shown, there is a correlation between the HOLC grades and contemporary environmental outcomes. But what we need a bit more deepening of, or a deeper understanding of, is the mechanisms that produce that correlation. So if this relationship isn't necessarily causation, but it seems like it's helping us understand something about the urban environment and how we got here. So, okay, I'm going to go through and hypothesize a few additional mechanistic pathways that get us to our environmental outcomes today. There will be a couple of arrows that will show up. So you can see on this diagram, the white arrows are the same as the existing model that we were working with. Blue arrows, I'll talk about in part 1 of my talk, so that'll just cue you into what we'll be looking at when. Red arrows, I'll talk about in part 2 of my talk, so just so you know what those colors represent. Okay, so critiques I already mentioned. There were a suite of other policies that produced racial segregation prior to 1930s, prior to redlining. And so let's add those into our mechanistic model. Other strategies that produce racial segregation include racial covenants, exclusionary zoning, real estate steering, policing the color line by neighborhood associations. So I'm talking about white mob violence. Hold on, I'm already losing my voice. Okay, so now we have these additional forms of segregation in our model. Okay. Sorry, it's always so sad when you've made a presentation and it looks like really good on your computer and then it just doesn't look good when it's being presented. Okay, so we have these additional segregating policies, and now I'm proposing some other mechanisms of how they might be shaping contemporary outcomes. So the racial segregation and the urban landscape prior to the advent of redlining possibly could have shaped where cities and also private individuals were investing in green spaces. So we know that privilege structures landscape today, maybe privilege structured the landscape then, and maybe whiter, wealthier neighborhoods got more investment from cities and green spaces and tree planting and new sewers, whatever the environmental causal agent here is. Perhaps that structured where those investments went, that shaped our outcomes for 1930s urban nature, which then maybe shaped the grade that the HOLC gave. And then that ultimately leads to our contemporary environmental outcomes. Okay, so that's our first mechanistic pathway. And I'll talk about that looking specifically at racial covenants in part 1. Okay, our second mechanistic pathway is much the same, but later. So our segregating policies shaped 1930s sociodemographics, which then again, in turn shaped additional investments in urban nature after the 1930s, after the redlining maps. So again, cities may have invested more in some neighborhoods, private individuals may have had more of their own disposable income to invest in, whether it's their local park, whether it's planting lots of trees in their own backyard. And that again shapes contemporary environmental outcomes. Okay, and so I'll talk about sort of thinking about all of these pathways as possible mechanisms driving the analysis that I'm looking at in part 2. We will compare racial covenants and redlining and their effects for the contemporary urban environment in that study. Okay, I think that's it for our background. Let's get into some of the empirics. Okay, so part 1, we're looking at the emergence of racial segregation in Minneapolis and its consequences for urban green spaces. Okay, so in this map, we are looking at racial covenants in Minneapolis. Racial covenants are, and this data is courtesy of Mapping Prejudice. Why did I do it in this order? So racial covenants there we go. Racial covenants were added to property deeds, and they were used to prevent the sale or occupancy of a particular property by a person of color. And they were used in Minneapolis starting in 1910. That's the oldest deed that the Mapping Prejudice Project, who has mapped all of the racial covenants, has found. And they're used in Minneapolis. I think the latest ones we find are actually in the 1960s, but for the most part, they stopped being used in the 1950s. About 1955 is the cutoff. And that was after the state of Minnesota passed a law making it unenforceable, making racial covenants unenforceable. And so, okay, we can see blue areas are where the covenants were. And then I'm also overlaying this covenants map with the investments in the Minneapolis park system that were made from 1910 till 1950. So during the time when racial covenants were in use, where was the city of Minneapolis investing in parks? And those parks are sort of highlighted in that brighter green, darker outline. And you can see just sort of like a visual glance at the map that the places where new parks were being added to the park system more often than not, also have racial covenants nearby. And in fact, of the 47 or so park spaces that were added to the park system during this period, about 3/4 of them have a racial covenant within one city block of that park space. And so these new additions to the park space seem like they were primarily going to these exclusively white segregated neighborhoods. Yep. And so our research question here is, what mechanisms underlie this pattern that we see in Minneapolis that lead to this correlation between racial covenants and new additions to the Minneapolis park system? So the methods in this study, we primarily used archival research. So here are some of the archives that I dove into to try and track this down, looking at property records, looking at the park board's archives, looking at the special collections library at the Hennepin County, as well as historic newspapers. And I pair this archival research with digital mapping tools to try and have a deep understanding of how these two processes were working together to produce this outcome. Okay, explain that. Just to give you an example of what a racial covenant sounds like. So this is one that was found in the deed in Minneapolis. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, occupied, leased, sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full blood of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And so these would be added to deeds and used to ensure that the property was sold only to someone who was white. Okay, so my hypothesis going into this study was that racial covenants were added to properties by developers opportunistically after new parks were added to the system. So the park board announces, hey, we're going to build a park here. And then a developer comes in and scoops up the land around that park because they know that it will become more desirable as the new park is built. And they add racial covenants with the hopes of producing high value real estate. So that was what I expected to find when I went into the archives. And we do find some examples of that. So here are two that I've pointed out. This one is Brenmar Meadows, sort of in Western Minneapolis. And after the park board announced the expansion of Brenmar Meadows, developers went in, bought these covenant parcels here, added covenants to them, and made a new development. We also see this in Waite Park. This is in Northeast Minneapolis, same deal. This was actually the same year that the Minnesota legislature ruled that you can't add any new covenants to property deeds. As the park board added this park, the developer scooped up the properties around the new park and added racial covenants and sort of a blanket across the development to ensure that it stayed white. Okay, so we see that as one mechanism, but we also see that that's only a small fraction of the parks that are closely linked to racial covenants. And we also found that developers who are adding racial covenants to properties we're offering the park board to pay for the new park themselves. So they would say, yes, if you build this park here, I'll cover the costs. And they were also donating land or selling at a cheap price land directly to the park board. And in doing so, they weren't just opportunistically following park board investments, but they were asking the park board to work with them to put developments in their racially exclusive neighborhoods, or to put new parks in their racially exclusive neighborhoods. Okay, so let's do a quick case study of one of those examples. This is Walton Hills. It's near Lake of the Isles in Minneapolis. On the right, we have Edmund Walton. He was the first real estate developer to add racially restrictive covenants to properties in Minneapolis. And Edmund Walton, being the savvy businessman that he was tracking the local real estate business news. And he saw that there was quite a bit of excitement and properties around Lake of the Isles, particularly after the park board built its first canal. So there's a canal that connects Lake of the Isles to the Dam Muskoka to the south, sort of right here in this map. And so this canal was put in first, and there was a huge celebration, and everyone came to see the first boats passing through this new canal. And this generated a lot of interest in real estate in proximity to that canal, as seen from this newspaper headline that says, "Canal zone lots are much in demand. Lake of the Isles district is not checked by May winter weather." I think we can all relate to winter weather in May. And so that article goes on to talk about, Mr. Worth, the superintendent of parks, is very enthusiastic over this property. And he plans to lay out a new boulevard connecting Cedar Lake to the rest of the lakes, and to reclaim all of the low ground that is now spoiling the natural beauty of this area. And so at this time, you see these swamps were thought of, these wetlands that provide very many important ecosystem services were thought of landscapes to be wiped out and to be reclaimed. And so the park board set out to do that in proximity to Lake of the Isles. So this newspaper article is from 1909. And that same year, Edmund Walton bought up, I think it was 130 or so lots along the edge of Lake of the Isles and that lowland that the park board had started to express interest in developing. So he bought, first, this is Walton Hills, that area indicated in red. And he also purchased the second addition to Walton Hills, so one development, two maps. And you can see in this map here, this is the map you file with the county when you're developing new property. You can see he purchased not just the lots that he developed to sell homes. He also bought the land that was indicated on this map as wetland. Why did he buy this wetland that he couldn't develop? Because he knew that he could turn around and sell it to the park board, and they would build a new canal. And so he did just that. He sold it to the park board for actually more than he originally paid for it. And then the park board went about constructing their new canal that connects Lake of the Isles to Cedar Lake. And there we see it today. We love to paddleboard in it. We love to jump off the bridge. Okay. And so, in doing so, Walton ensured for his new development, it wouldn't be next to an undesirable swamp, and instead it would be next to brand new waterfront property. And Walton touted this waterfront property and his advertisements for Walton Hills. So you can see this is an advertisement in the Minneapolis Tribune for the development. Lake of the Isles is indicated in the advertisement, the new lagoon where the canal went in. He's also even indicated boulevard trees, really highlighting these amenities. And then he also includes the language of the racial restriction in the advertisement. So you can see here, I don't need to read this sort of violent language. You can see there that he's not being shy about the fact that there were racial restrictions included in this development. And in fact, he was using those racial restrictions as a selling feature and really highlighting them in how he was advertising these properties. Okay, Edmund Walton wasn't alone in doing this. He did this in many, many of his developments across the city. And so did many of Minneapolis's biggest real estate developers during this time. I think I think we found like 20 or so examples of something like this happening, where developers would court these investments by the park board into their developments. And so some takeaways from this archival work: the pristine nature and white racial exclusivity were a key strategy for producing high-end real estate during this period. And this shaped the racial and environmental geography that drove federal patterns, patterns of federal lending. So the redlining maps. Ooh, okay. Okay. Sitting with that. All right. Now that we have a sense for sort of how these mechanisms worked, how people in privilege were able to shape the urban environment in this way, let's look at some of the consequences today. Okay, all right, returning to this for a second. We just talked a little bit about this arm of our diagram. So let's look here. What happens when we look at racial covenants? And we're going to look at them in comparison to redlining, since those redlining studies are so commonplace, to try and understand how this mechanism, how racial covenants compare to redlining, to sort of deepen our understanding of the processes that produce contemporary disparities in the urban environment. How am I doing on time? Oh, good. We're doing great. That's so good. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, all right. So here is our maps for Minneapolis. We have the racial covenants map that we've been talking about. So racial covenants are indicated in this map in sort of these light whitish blue blobs. And then the redlining map is overlaid here. And again, green was the best, red was the worst, and you can see how the Minneapolis landscape was given those grades. You can also see by comparing these two geographies here, another limitation of the redlining maps. They were only produced for the urban core. And so it doesn't really help us understand the broader landscape of like the urban, suburban landscape it doesn't help us understand the broader urban landscape. So if we think about geographies of privilege in cities today, the most exclusive neighborhoods are often those suburban communities just outside of the city. And redlining maps don't really help us understand those geographies of privilege, particularly in terms of environmental privilege. And so racial covenants might teach us something that we don't know just from using the redlining maps. There is a map of land surface temperature. We're going to talk about it some more. Okay, so there are two research questions that were animating this study. First, does the historic presence of a racial covenant correlate to contemporary patterns of interurban heat and its correlates? So the correlates that we're looking at here are tree canopy cover and impervious surface cover. And then how do the effects of racial covenants compare to the effects of redlining? Okay, some sources for our data are listed here in case anybody is wondering. Okay, our methods for question one. So we were looking specifically to answer this first question: do covenants correlate to contemporary patterns of interurban heat? We're looking in this study at Minneapolis, as well as the 10 surrounding cities that make up the inner ring suburbs in Minneapolis. We are only analyzing patterns in areas that are zoned residential, so that we're comparing apples to apples. I think it would be a very obvious conclusion to look at covenants in comparison, which are only added to residential properties, right? They're only added to personal homes, and compare that to areas that are zoned commercial or zoned industrial, and say, yeah, the environmental quality is better in the racial covenants. And so to avoid making that sort of false comparison, we exclude those areas from this study. We overlay a grid, a hex grid, and then use that hex grid to extract the contemporary temperature, land surface temperature, extract the mean temperature within each of those grid cells, and then award each of those grid cells a yes, no, covenant, presence, absence to get a data set that has mean temperature for a grid across this whole landscape. And then does it have a racial covenant, or did it have a racial covenant, or did it not? And then we use, I type that wrong, a spatial autoregressive model. Ignore what that says. To see if presence absence of a covenant is significantly correlated with temperature outcomes today. Okay, I'm not going to do that to y'all. I'm going to do this. Okay, so the answer is yes, it does. So we look at that model and we do find significant correlation there, but the effect is it's honestly really, really small. It's you know, it's about 0.5 degrees Celsius, which isn't nothing. But if you're looking at sort of the differences in heat that lead to sort of different outcomes and human health, this is probably not going to lead to a lot more people like dying of heat stroke and an extreme heat event. But it does suggest that the legacy of racial covenants continue to structure slightly different outcomes in the environment today, looking across this whole landscape, trying to understand why we get such a small result. Like some of the redlining studies find differences of 10 degrees Celsius or something, like much larger differences. I think one of the key things to think about here is sort of how the racial covenants are positioned relative to the whole city. They sort of serve as a wall that was intended to keep people of color from even trying to move to the suburbs. And so even if a residential area and these suburban communities didn't have a racial covenant, it is likely that given the proliferation of covenants right along that edge of the city of Minneapolis, that these suburbs were almost exclusively white for a lot of their early development. And so I think that that's part of why we don't see a particularly large effect size, is that there are other geographies of privilege at play here. So, okay, that's that. Part 2, question 2, how do the effects of racial covenants compare to the effect of redlining? And so to address this question, we did a buffer analysis around our racial covenants so that we're comparing apples to apples. And so you can see the redlining maps were drawn at the neighborhood scale. So they include things like roads and parks and parking lots because they were covering this whole broad geography rather than the individual parcel of a home. While the redlining maps were drawn, while the racial covenant data is at the individual home parcel. So to again make sure we're comparing like to like, we created a buffer that I didn't write down on my slide, and I don't quite remember what it is. I don't remember what. We created a buffer that I believe is about 0.1 miles around the racial covenants. So a little over a city block around a property with a racial covenant, but don't quote me on that. I'll look at the paper in just a second and get back to you with the specifics there. And so that way that buffer captures not just the individual property, but also the road and the sidewalk next to it, and maybe the adjacent park. And so we can more effectively compare between the racial covenants and the redlining data. We calculated area weighted means for our environmental variables of interest, Rand's MANOVAs, and used those to compare both the 4 redlining grades to properties with a racial covenant, and then also to compare covenants with N redlining grades. And so what I mean by that is, I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. You'll see. Okay, so let's look at that first question. How do covenants compare to the 4 redlining grades? And so here we have a map of land surface temperature. The red colors are temperature that is elevated over the mean. The blue colors are temperatures that are cooler than the mean. This map shows those buffers we created for our racial covenants. This map shows the redlining areas. And then a graph over there on the right, we have, we're going from A, B, C to D. And you can see the temperature gets hotter as we go from A, B, C to D. You can also see that covenants look a lot like those A or maybe B areas in terms of their temperature. This is why I have this. Okay, so now we're looking at tree canopy cover. We see much the same. As we go from A to D, you get less tree canopy cover. Covenants look somewhere between an A and a B again. And finally, impervious surface cover. Same deal. As we go from A to D, we get increasingly more impervious surface cover. Covenants look something like an A. Okay, that isn't a surprising result. It's important to know because we've never done an analysis of racial covenants and how they compare to redlining. So, okay, this makes sense. The second part of this analysis was looking at covenanted properties that fell within those different redlining grades. And so how does the A grade compare to properties that had a covenant with an A? How does the D grade compare to if you received a D, but you also had racially different covenants on the property? Does that make sense? I get some nods if I'm okay. Great. And so what we see is that, yes, if we look between A and D, D grades were hotter. This is temperature again. So A is cooler, D is hotter. But if you were a D and you had a racial covenant, your temperature looks today pretty much like an A or a B. And so this legal protection of whiteness, this guarantee of whiteness and of racial exclusivity, in effect ameliorated the effects of not having access to these federally backed mortgages 20 years down the road. And so what this is starting to show us is that these legal mechanisms that were put in place starting in the 1910s, lasting until the 1960s, are having these like deeply lasting effects on the urban environment. This pattern or this trend holds for tree canopy cover. Again, you see like a bump up effect if you had a racial covenant. And again, for impervious surface cover. Okay, that's it for data that I had to show you. And so some takeaways from this. Environmental outcomes are shaped by many layers of privilege. So it's not just racial covenants. That's not going to tell you the whole story. It's not just redlining. That's not going to tell you the whole story. But these cumulative outcomes work together to shape the environmental geographies today. And then policies that shape the built and natural environment have these lasting legacy effects. Okay, returning to this. Now we have, I really don't have anything else to say. Okay, so now we've looked at racial covenants, we've looked at redlining, and we've looked at their effect on the contemporary urban environment. Okay, some broad overarching takeaways from me from this work. The work of doing these historical analyses to try and understand the processes that produce disparities in the urban environment help to shift our baseline and help us understand that the disparities in the urban environment today are not natural, but were actively produced through very intentional policies. This helps us understand the very social context of urban nature. So when we're thinking about nature in cities, it's deeply intertwined with the communities that live there. Investments in urban nature have profound consequences for the health, well-being, and wealth building in those communities. And I think it also suggests something about the importance of partnerships when we're thinking particularly about management work, but I also think we can think about this in terms of our research, particularly on nature and the urban environment. So we saw these examples of collaborations between the park planners and these developers, and it had really disastrous consequences for environmental justice. But what that also suggests is that very intentional partnerships and working with communities, particularly communities that have been disinvested, has the potential to have really amazing consequences for the urban environment. And so thinking really intentionally about who we're working with and the kind of work that our research does in the world. And that's it. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, okay.
Okay, one first, it's amazing to see how you developed this over the last few years. It's just like, Rebecca and I were in a summer fellowship together, and it's like, this is just phenomenal. Two, I'm thinking about thinking along the lines of shifting baselines, and like just sort of knowing the shape of the community partners you have and their interest in gentrification. I'm wondering, like, even if you're not looking at it for your data, like, what are your thoughts on where research should go, or where your research is going in relation to how gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul is continuing to shift these baselines through like the cycles of disinvestments, and then like developers coming in and snapping that up?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think that's a really important question. One thing that I often think about when I talk about like sort of what green gentrification is. So green gentrification refers specifically to gentrification that's linked to investments in urban nature. And so we already saw in this research that investments in urban nature can create really valuable property. And so we see that happening today, where investments in nature create really valuable property. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the way that, one, green gentrification relies on this baseline, on this like artificially manufactured baseline in which parts of the urban environment are lacking in these green amenities, have this legacy of pollution, have this legacy of disinvestment. And so those areas become really ripe for this kind of green development, where you can clean up the site and add a new park. And suddenly you can totally change the character of the neighborhood and allow for gentrification. And so in that way, I've been thinking about sort of the way that baseline shifts and how easy it is for like the environmental justice struggles that are pushing for cleanup to get co-opted. I also think that some of the things that you've told me about your work have been really important for thinking about shifting baselines in terms of like our relationship to the soil and our relationship to how we're cultivating and like building relation with our urban nature, and sort of the value of those like long-term community institutions. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. That was really long-winded of me. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question related to gentrification. Like, there have been studies that have concluded that the creation of parks further increased gentrification. So in low-income offset, like low-income, sometimes these communities can or cannot be the POC communities, immigrant communities. If those communities do not have an interest in building a park or increasing their property value or being bought out by other communities, how can partnerships help with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the keys when we're thinking about disrupting sort of that relationship between, one, that question is a really like broad and hard question, and like good of you to ask, and I'm going to answer it in only the smallest way. But so as we're thinking about that relationship between urban greening and like increased property values or maybe gentrification, I think one of the key questions to ask is like, who is that greening for? And you know, I think this is more of like anecdotally true, like true in a qualitative way. I don't want to make like a quantitative claim here, but as I have seen it happen and seen it happen in the literature, greening efforts that are done really intentionally with communities and that are rooted in those partnerships, and are really rooted in the question of like, what do you need? What do you want from your green space? Look really different than the kinds of green spaces or new park investments that we associate with gentrification, that lead to those like rapid increases in property values. So that's one answer, right? Like, so we can think about like the difference between the High Line in New York, which is like big and flashy and brings in a ton of tourists, And it was never like really meant to be for the community versus like maybe a smaller park that has programming that and daycare for communities and cooking classes in the recreation center and spaces for urban gardening. Like those can look really different, and when the community is really like leading the way in terms of that park planning, the outcomes can be really different. I think I'm saying can because on the other side of that, some of those partnerships need to look like community organizing and pushing for policies that sort of intervene in gentrification. Like gentrification isn't just like a natural phenomenon. It happens when our policies and cities like allow it to happen. And so we can push for things like tenant protections, rent control, community land trusts, different ways of like curbing that relationship between new green space and rapidly rising property values, or property values that rise in a way that threatens to displace people. So, okay, yeah, I think that's that answer, yeah.
We have a question from Zoom. I'm gonna let Sarah ask her question.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering that since the population of Minneapolis has increased quite a bit since the redlining was done and the covenants that you studied, I wondered how what you knew about race in the redlining areas today and in the areas that you studied that were under racial covenants. Has that, I know you've been talking about gentrification, but do you know much about what the shift has been in populations?
Yeah, so just to make sure I understand your question, are you asking what the racial demographics in those different, in the areas that were redlined or the areas that had racial covenants, what they look like today and how they're changing?
What they look like today, since you still see some of that legacy, like you said, legacy, what's legacy versus what's, being amplified.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. And also, I'm really sorry, there isn't a map up here that's showing you that. So the areas that had racial covenants are still very, very white. Upwards of 85% of the population in areas that had racial covenants are white today. And areas that were redlined, that were given that D grade, it's a little bit more of a mix. So a lot of, okay, so looking at this map, we see a lot of our, those red line neighborhoods were along the river because the river was an industrial corridor. But as industrial activity along the river in Minneapolis has slowed down, that's where we're seeing a lot of this like urban revitalization, new riverfront parks. And so that's really changed the demographics of those areas, especially around downtown, especially in like Northeast and St. Anthony, Maine. Those areas have gone from mostly very working class, and particularly in like near North Minneapolis, predominantly Black. That's Minneapolis's historically Black neighborhood. Now near North Minneapolis is basically part of the North Loop, which is like very white and very high income. And so we are seeing, particularly in the areas that were redlined, we're starting to see those population shifts. And I think that, I think that like, that raises like a whole suite of other questions, like as these populations have shifted, we are seeing both like a shift in where industrial activity is happening, like more industrial activity happens on the margins of cities, and also lower income folks are having to move to the margins of cities. So we're seeing like this process repeat itself, but just in different geographies today. And so, yeah, I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that is helpful. I mean, I've done some work looking at soils across cities and saw that places that were gentrified, those soils had been leveled, and the soils were no longer toxic compared to the cities that were, the D neighborhoods were retained and stayed racially segregated. So I was curious, like what you were seeing. Like I didn't understand the race part of Minneapolis because I haven't been there in a while.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh man, I would love to see your work. They should.
I will email you.
Cool. Okay. Other questions from folks? Yeah.
I have a couple of Dorothy methods questions. One is just, do you have a sense of whether redlining or racial covenants, which was more enforced, if you will, like which one was more effective at maintaining whiteness, if you will?
Yeah, I think that we can answer that one. I think we can say like pretty solidly that racial covenants were very, very good at enforcing whiteness, while redlining didn't necessarily enforce whiteness. It just, it allowed areas that were white to become even more privileged. It allowed them to have access to this whole new pot of money to make sure they could keep their home and improve their home that wasn't available to other communities. And so, yeah, that's sort of a key difference there.
Yeah, it's surprising. There's just more variability in the covenant numbers.
Yeah.
Compared to the redlining numbers.
Yeah, so
you know what?
that's good observation. Yeah, that's a really, what's the best, like, yeah. Okay, so that's, if we think, just, this is what I think is happening there. So if we look, let's actually take it back to just the plain covenants map in Minneapolis, this one. So if we look at where covenants were added to properties in Minneapolis, you don't see them for the most part. Obviously, I presented an exception to this rule. You don't really see them like right along the lakes and like the most high income, expensive parts of the city. And what we, particularly the researchers at Mapping Prejudice, think is going on there is that racial covenants were used when the status of a neighborhood was questionable, when they like wanted it to be a high value neighborhood, they wanted it to be a high privilege neighborhood, but it wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't an already established neighborhood. And so they needed these protections of whiteness. While in these other neighborhoods that are a little bit older, it was already well established that they were very expensive parts of the city. And because of the intersection of race and class in our country, that they were going to be racially homogenous as well as class homogenous. And so I think that that's part of why you see a bit more variability, and you don't see like quite as much privilege associated with redlining as you do with those A neighborhoods. Because, wait, what did I say? You don't see as much privilege associated with covenants as you do with those A neighborhoods, because they were used in places that weren't like quite as established and inherently privileged at this time. I think that that's part of what's going on there.
Then if you go back to your model, one other question. Yeah, this is fine. Those other things in your top box are all really interesting. Do you have ideas for how to quantify them or apply them?
Yeah, some easier than others. I think something like zoning is, you know, a nice parallel to the work that we've done already, and that zoning maps are maps that you can overlay and do similar analyses. And so, yeah, I think that there's a real potential that if you look at the early zoning maps and look at how they evolved over time, you might be able to trace similar mechanisms at play. And honestly, that hasn't been done yet. It hasn't been done yet, and I think it would be really useful to do. And now that I'm saying it out loud, maybe I'll do it. Yeah, things like real estate steering are a lot harder because there's no like data being like, and I didn't take this person to that neighborhood, but we like know that it happened. Sort of doing that archival work and looking at the real estate journals and seeing like that was part of the real estate code of ethics for like 40 or 50 years. And so I think that that's where the archives are really informative. Something like policing the color line. This is another area where I think Mapping Prejudice has done really good work. So again, they're a team of historians. And so they've done a lot of work of going through the archives and documenting these examples of white mob violence where someone who was not considered white at the time would try and move into a white neighborhood and would be violently excluded, forced out. And so, you know, that's something that we can map. We can look at like where and when those neighborhoods were. I don't know that we can like necessarily draw a quantitative conclusion about how that shaped the environment, but I think that that does give us more of a qualitative understanding about access to privileged environmental spaces.